Hello, this is Morel Benard with the continuation of the story, David Copperfield. And the last words were that he soon returned, greatly improved in appearance, but so rubicund that I couldn't help thinking his face had this in common with the lobsters, crabs, and crawfish, that it went into the hot water very black and came out very red. After tea, when the door was shut and all was made snug, the nights being cold and misty now, it seemed to me the most delicious retreat that the imagination of man could conceive. To hear the wind getting up out at sea, to know that the fog was creeping over the desolate flat outside, and to look at the fire and think that there was no house near but this one, and this one a boat, was like enchantment. Little Emily had overcome her shyness and was sitting by my side upon the lowest and least of the lockers, which was just large enough for us two, and just fitted into the chimney corner. Mrs. Peggoty, with the white apron, was knitting on the opposite side of the fire. Peggoty, at her needlework, was as much at home with St. Paul's and the bit of wax candle as if they had never known any other roof. Ham, who had been giving me my first lesson in all fours, was trying to recollect a scheme of telling fortunes with the dirty cards, and was printing off fishy impressions of his thumb on all the cards he turned. Mr. Peggoty was smoking his pipe. I felt it was a time for conversation and confidence. "Mr. Peggoty," says I. "Sir," says he. "Did you give your son the name of Ham because you lived in a sort of ark?" Mr. Peggoty seemed to think it a deep idea, but answered, "No, sir, I never give him no name." "Who gave him that name then?" said I, putting question number 2 of the catechism to Mr. Peggoty. "Why, sir, his father give it to him," said Mr. Peggoty. "I thought you were his father." "My brother Joe was his father," said Mr. Peggoty. "Dead, Mr. Peggoty?" I hinted after a respectful pause. "Drowned dead," said Mr. Peggoty. I was very much surprised that Mr. Peggoty was not Ham's father, and began to wonder whether I was mistaken about his relationship to anybody else there. I was so curious to know that I made up my mind to have it out with Mr. Peggoty. "Little Emily," I said, glancing at her. "She's your daughter, isn't she, Mr. Peggoty?" "No, sir. My brother-in-law, Tom, was her father." I couldn't help it. "Dead, Mr. Peggoty?" I hinted after another respectful silence. "Drowned dead," said Mr. Peggoty. I felt the difficulty of resuming the subject, but had not got to the bottom of it yet, and must get to the bottom somehow. So I said, "Haven't you any children, Mr. Peggoty?" "No, master," he answered with a short laugh. "I'm a bachelor." "A bachelor?" I said, astonished. "Why, who's that, Mr. Peggoty?" pointing to the person in the apron who was knitting. "That's Mrs. Gummidge," said Mr. Peggoty. "Gummidge, Mr. Peggoty?" But at this point, Peggoty, I mean my own peculiar Peggoty, made such impressive motions to me not to ask any more questions that I could only sit and look at all the silent company until it was time to go to bed. Then, in the privacy of my own little cabin, she informed me that Ham and Emily were an orphan nephew and niece whom my host had at different times adopted in their childhood when they were left destitute, and that Mrs. Gummidge was the widow of his partner in a boat who had died very poor. He was but a poor man himself, said Peggoty, but as good as gold and as true as steel. Those were her similes. The only subject she informed me on which he ever showed a violent temper or swore an oath, was this generosity of his, and if it were ever referred to by any one of them, he struck the table a heavy blow with his right hand, had split it on one such occasion, and swore a dreadful oath that he would be gormed if he didn't cut and run for good, if it was ever mentioned again. It appeared, in answer to my inquiries, that nobody had the least idea of the etymology of this terrible verb passive to be gormed, but that they all regarded it as constituting a most solemn imprecation. I was very sensible of my entertainer's goodness, and listened to the women's going to be bed in another little crib like mine at the opposite end of the boat, and to him and Ham hanging up 2 hammocks for themselves on the hooks I had noticed in the roof, in a very luxurious state of mind, enhanced by my being sleepy. As slumber gradually stole upon me, I heard the wind howling out at sea and coming on across the flat so fiercely that I had a lazy apprehension of the great deep rising in the night. But I bethought to myself that I was in a boat after all, and that a man like Mr. Peggoty was not a bad person to have on board if anything did happen. Nothing happened, however, worse than morning. Almost as soon as it shone upon the oyster-shell frame of my mirror, I was out of bed, and out with little Emily, picking up stones upon the beach. "You're quite a sailor, I suppose?" I said to Emily. I don't know that I supposed anything of the kind, but I felt it an act of gallantry to say something, and a shining sail close to us made such a pretty little image of itself at the moment, in her bright eye, that it came into my head to say this. "No," replied Emily, shaking her head. "I'm afraid of the sea." "Afraid?" I said, with a becoming air of boldness and looking very big at the mighty ocean. "I ain't." "Ah, but it's cruel," said Emily. "I've seen it very cruel to some of our men. I've seen it tear a boat as big as our house all to pieces." "I hope it wasn't the boat that father was drowned in," said Emily. "No, not that one. I never see that boat." "Nor him?" I asked her. Little Emily shook her head. "Not to remember." Here was a coincidence. I immediately went into an explanation how I had never seen my own father, and how my mother and I had always lived by ourselves in the happiest state imaginable, and lived so then, and always meant to live so, and how my father's grave was in the churchyard near our house and shaded by a tree, beneath the boughs of which I had walked and heard the birds sing many a pleasant morning. But there were some differences between Emily's orphanhood and mine, it appeared. She had lost her mother before her father, and where her father's grave was no one knew, except that it was somewhere in the depths of the sea. Besides, said Emily, as she looked about for shells and pebbles, your father was a gentleman, and your mother is a lady, and my father was a fisherman, and my mother was a fisherman's daughter, and my Uncle Dan is a fisherman. Dan is Mr. Peggoty, is he? Said I. Uncle Dan, yonder, answered Emily, nodding at the boathouse. Yes, I mean him. He must be very good, I should think. Good, said Emily. If I was ever to be a lady, I'd give him a sky blue coat with diamond buttons, nankeen trousers, a red velvet waistcoat, a cocked hat, a large gold watch, a silver pipe, and a box of money. I said I had no doubt that Mr. Peggoty well deserved these treasures. I must acknowledge that I felt it difficult to picture him quite at his ease in the raiment proposed for him by his grateful little niece, and that I was particularly doubtful of the policy of the cocked hat. But I kept these sentiments to myself. Little Emily had stopped and looked up at the sky in her enumeration of these articles, as if they were a glorious vision. We went on again, picking up shells and pebbles. You would like to be a lady? I said. Emily looked at me and laughed and nodded. Yes. I should like it very much. We would all be gentle folks together then. Me and Uncle and Ham and Mrs. Gummidge. We wouldn't mind them when there comes stormy weather. Not for our own sakes, I mean. We would for the poor fishermen's, to be sure, and we'd help 'em with money when they come to any hurt. It seemed to me to be a very satisfactory and therefore not at all improbable picture. I expressed my pleasure in the contemplation of it, and little Emily was emboldened to say shyly, Don't you think you are afraid of the sea now? It was quite enough to reassure me, but I have no doubt if I had seen a moderately large wave come tumbling in, I should have taken to my heels with an awful recollection of her drowned relations. However, I said, No, and I added, You don't seem to be either, though you say you are, for she was walking much too near the brink of a sort of old jetty or wooden causeway we had strolled upon, and I was afraid of her falling over. I'm not afraid in this way, said little Emily, but I wake when it blows, and tremble to think of Uncle Dan and Ham, and believe I hear 'em crying out for help. That's why I should like so much to be a lady. But I'm not afraid in this way, not a bit. Look here. She started from my side and ran along a jagged timber which protrude from the place we stood upon, and overhung the deep water at some height, without the least defence. The incident is so impressed on my remembrance that if I were a draftsman, I could draw it from here, I dare say, accurately as it was that day. And little Emily springing forward to her destruction, as it appeared to me, with a look that I have never forgotten, directed far out to sea. The light, bold, fluttering little figure turned and came back safe to me, and I soon laughed at my fears, and at the cry I had uttered, fruitlessly in any case, for there was no one near. But there have been times since in my manhood, many times there have been, when I have thought, is it possible, among the possibilities of hidden things, that in the sudden rashness of the child, and her wild look so far off, there was any merciful attraction of her into danger, any tempting her towards him permitted on the part of her dead father, that her life might have a chance of ending that day. There has been a time since when I have wondered whether, if the life before her could have been revealed to me at a glance, and so revealed as that a child could fully comprehend it, and if her preservation could have depended on a motion of my hand, I ought to have held it up to save her. There has been a time since, I do not say it lasted long, but it has been, when I have asked myself the question, would it have been better for little Emily to have had the waters close above her head that morning in my sight? And when I've answered yes, it would have been. This made me premature. I've set it down too soon, perhaps, but let it stand. We strolled a long way and loaded ourselves with things that we thought curious, and put some stranded starfish carefully back into the water. I hardly know enough of the race at this moment to be quite certain whether they had reason to feel obliged to us for doing so, or the reverse, and then made our way home to Mr. Peggoty's dwelling. We stopped under the lee of the lobster outhouse to exchange an innocent kiss, and went into breakfast, glowing with health and pleasure. Like two young Mavishes, Mr. Peggoty said. I knew this meant in our local dialect, like two young thrushes, and received it as a compliment. Of course, I was in love with little Emily. I'm sure I loved that baby quite as truly, quite as tenderly, with greater purity and more disinterestedness than can enter into the best love of the later life of time, high and ennobling as it is. I'm sure my fancy raised up something round that blue-eyed mite of a child, which etherealized and made a very angel of her. If any sunny forenoon she had spread a little pair of wings and flown away before my eyes, I don't think I should have regarded it as much more than I had reason to expect. We used to walk about that dim old flat at Yarmouth in a loving manner, hours and hours. The days sported by us, as if time had not grown up himself yet, but were a child too, and always at play. I told Emily I adored her, and that unless she confessed she adored me, I should be reduced to the necessity of killing myself with a sword. She said she did, and I have no doubt she did. As to any sense of inequality or youthfulness or other difficulty in our way, little Emily and I had no such trouble, because we had no future. We made no more provision for growing older than we did for growing younger. We were the admiration of Mrs. Gummidge and Peggoty, who used to whisper of an evening when we sat, lovingly, on our little locker side by side. "Lor, wasn't it beautiful?" Mr. Peggoty smiled at us from behind his pipe, and Ham grinned all the evening and did nothing else. They had something of the sort of pleasure in us, I suppose, that they might have had in a pretty toy, or a pocket model of the Colosseum. I soon found out that Mrs. Gummidge did not always make herself so agreeable as she might have been expected to do under the circumstances of her residence with Mr. Peggoty. Mrs. Gummidge's was rather a fretful disposition, and she whimpered more sometimes than was comfortable for other parties in so small an establishment. I was very sorry for her, but there were moments when would it be more agreeable, I thought, if Mrs. Gummidge had had a convenient apartment of her own to retire to, and had stopped there until her spirits revived. Mr. Peggoty went occasionally to a public house called the Willing Mind. I discovered this by his being out on the second or third evening of our visit, and by Mrs. Gummidge's looking up at the Dutch clock between 8 and 9, and saying he was there, and that, what was more, she had known in the morning he would go there. Mrs. Gummidge had been in a low state all day, and had burst into tears in the forenoon when the fire smoked. "I am a lone creature," were Mrs. Gummidge's words when that unpleasant occurrence took place, "and everything goes contrary with me." "Oh, it'll soon leave off," said Peggoty. I again mean, of course, our Peggoty. "And besides, you know, it's not more disagreeable to you than to us." "I feel it more," said Mrs. Gummidge. It was a very cold day, with cutting blast of wind. Mrs. Gummidge's peculiar corner of the fireside seemed to me to be the warmest and snuggest in the place, as her chair was certainly the easiest. But it didn't suit her that day at all. She was constantly complaining of the cold, and of its occasioning a visitation in her back, which she called the creeps. At last she shed tears on that subject, and said again that she was a lorn creature, and everything went contrary with her. "It is certainly very cold," said Peggoty. "Everybody must feel it so." "I feel it more than other people," said Mrs. Gummidge. So at dinner, when Mrs. Gummidge was always helped immediately after me, to whom the preference was given as a visitor of distinction, the fish were small and bony, and the potatoes were a little burnt. We all acknowledged that we felt there something of a disappointment, but Mrs. Gummidge said she felt it more than we did, and shed tears again, and made that former declaration with great bitterness. Join me, Morel Benard, for the next video about the life of David Copperfield. Join me. Look out, look out. And do subscribe to Study Coach UK channel. Please subscribe and share. But look out for the next video about the life of David Copperfield. I'll see you then. Bye.